Welcome to CBS News Primetime. I'm John Dickerson. One promising moon of Jupiter had 5 of the 6 essential elements necessary to sustain life, and now researchers say they've found number 6. The habitable planet bingo card is now full. Alien life? Maybe. First this.
We decided to leave our policy interest rate unchanged.
10 is enough. The Federal Reserve breaks its rate-raising streak to assess if more will be needed to get the planets aligned.
Seems like the right time to just say, let's take a break, let's see where things stand.
I think there are some deeds done in darkness that obviously need to be uncovered.
The Southern Baptist Convention kicks 2 churches out of its constellation, including one of its largest planets. And reporting from inside the Biden administration's deliberations over concerns about encouraging migrants. But we begin our report with a pause in interest rate hikes. For 15 months, the Federal Reserve has been trying to catch up to rising inflation by slowing economic activity. Overall, the Fed has boosted rates by 5 percentage points since March of last year, including a 1/4 percentage point last month, all the while defending against charges that it was both too slow to act and that it might be now moving too aggressively. CBS News' Weijia Zhang has more.
The Federal Reserve's pause on interest rate hikes came with a warning from Chairman Jerome Powell. It may not last for long.
Inflation has not really moved down. It has not so far reacted much to our existing rate hikes, and so we're going to have to keep at it.
Inflation has come down from its peak of 9% to 4%, but the Fed wants to get it to 2%. While the cost of electricity, eggs and meat, and gasoline went down in May, overall grocery prices were nearly 6% more expensive over last year. The prices of margarine, flour, and bread all up.
We've just seen huge increases in core staples that we need to make our product.
Bakery owner Jenna Huntsberger said the rising costs have taken a toll.
We're holding steady, but we're not seeing a growth in our sales. And I do think that's because consumers are just tired of inflation and they're really being very cautious with their discretionary income.
Over the course of 15 months and 10 straight interest rate hikes, the 30-year fixed mortgage rate has risen to nearly 7%. Credit card rates have soared to more than 20%. CBS News business analyst Jill Schlesinger.
The question for anyone sitting at home is, will these interest rates come down fast enough so that I can borrow money when I want to at a more affordable rate? I think it's safe to assume that the cost of servicing a loan or getting a new loan is going to remain high for the foreseeable future.
And Weijia joins me now from the White House. Weijia, what's the reaction been?
Well, John, the White House wants to draw a very clear line between any reaction it has to the Fed's decision. They want to be independent and publicly appear like they have no opinion about what happened today with the rate hike staying still. Of course, behind the scenes, they are cautiously optimistic because the decision directly impacts the economy. And so I think they are watching very closely and are well aware of the fact that the Fed signaled that there could be at least 2 more hikes by the end of this year. But they are encouraged by the data that shows that inflation is dropping. And of course, that is why the Fed has been raising their hikes, because they're trying to get inflation down to a certain target, which is 2%, by the way. And so far, they're not there yet. And that's why the chairman, Jerome Powell, was so clear-eyed about the fact that, even though they made this decision today, that may change in the coming months.
Weijia Zhang at the White House. Thank you, Weijia.
You're welcome.
Later this hour, we'll discuss reasons for the Fed's decision and what this all means for the broader economy. Daniel Penny, the former Marine who choked Jordan Neely to death on the New York City subway last month, has been indicted. The exact charges have not been unsealed. Penny held Neely in a chokehold for several minutes, even after he stopped resisting. Several witnesses said Neely had been making threats before the incident, and Penny claims he was acting out of self-defense and to protect other riders. Neely was homeless at the time and had suffered from mental illness. We might have suggested last week that the Republican presidential field was set. We'd like to amend that. The Republican mayor of Miami, Francis Suarez, has filed paperwork to run for president. He lives 480 miles from the other Florida GOP candidate, Governor Ron DeSantis, and 70 miles from the other one, Donald Trump. Suarez was first elected mayor of Miami in 2017. The 45-year-old is the first Hispanic candidate to join the crowded field of GOP hopefuls, and he is expected to formally launch his campaign Thursday in a speech at the Reagan Presidential Library in California. It's been 1 day since Donald Trump pleaded not guilty in federal criminal court in Miami. 6 days ago, when word broke of the indictment, the majority of the reaction from those in his party sought to blame the Justice Department and the sitting president. Some rivals even talked about offering Trump a pardon. Since then, others, including high-profile voices in the party, have focused on the seriousness of the charges against the president. And some Republicans have tried to hold both positions. CBS News chief election and campaign correspondent Robert Costa has the latest on the aftermath of the indictment.
As former President Trump continues to falsely claim that President Biden is directing cases for the Justice Department,
Crooked Joe Biden's weaponized Department of Injustice.
Attorney General Merrick Garland today defended appointing special counsel Jack Smith and touted his department's independence.
As I said when I appointed Mr. Smith, I did so because it underscores the Justice Department's commitment to both independence and accountability.
1 day after the historic arraignment on charges, including illegally hoarding classified documents at his Florida estate, Trump and his legal team are arguing he was allowed to take the documents after leaving the White House.
Under the Presidential Records Act, which is civil, not criminal, I had every right to have these documents. It's an absolute right. This is the law.
But according to the National Archives, the Presidential Records Act requires that all records created by presidents be turned over to the National Archives at the end of their administrations. Legal scholars say the Trump team's assertion will likely not fare well in court.
The reason why this argument is so hard to make that these are personal records and not presidential records or agency records is because they're classified documents on their face. They're literally created by another agency with classified information.
On the campaign trail, some Republicans now say Trump can defend himself.
I can't defend what is alleged in this indictment, but the president's entitled to his day in court.
And Robert Costa joins me now. Bob, there's a growing group of former Trump allies now expressing concern about the allegations. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is the latest I saw, and some rivals for the Republican nomination are modifying their positions, as we just saw from the former vice president there in your piece. What are you hearing behind the scenes? Is there this shift big and real, or is it just small?
It seems, based on my reporting, John, to be pretty small. I mean, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, he commands a profile in the national security and the foreign policy community, but he decided not to run for the Republican nomination this time around. And so many of the voices that are speaking out are those who are not in the race for president. They're people on the sidelines, respectfully. And what we're seeing right now is a Republican Party that's still grappling with how to deal with this historic indictment. Trump is someone who's plowing ahead, raising more than $6 million, according to his campaign, since he was indicted. And his rivals are looking at this, and as we've discussed for weeks, believing they have kind of a wait-and-see moment, wondering if he's going to get indicted in Georgia, wondering how this all plays out in the federal court in Florida, but still not sure of the political future here, because Trump again and again has rebounded from these kind of investigations.
What do you make, Bob, of the entrance of Francis Suarez, the Republican mayor of Miami, into the fray at this point?
Like a lot of Republicans around the country, he senses a bit of a soft political underbelly for Trump right now, that maybe Trump is vulnerable, if not this summer, down the line in the fall, if Republican voters start to get frustrated and tired of all the investigations, the litigation. And he's jumping in because there's really no cost to running at this point in American politics. If you're a mayor of a major city like Miami, or even a mayor of a city like South Bend, Indiana, which I went to college there at Notre Dame. This is an American political system that if you have enough of a social media profile and an ability to get on the debate stage and generate momentum on television, then you can create a bit of a political space for yourself in the country. If not land on the ticket, maybe in the cabinet, or give yourself some kind of stature that could provide you political capital.
Let me ask you a last question, Bob. When there are these big moments in national politics, we all naturally pay attention to them. But you and I have spent some time in small rooms with just a dozen people and these candidates. That work is all still going on. Give us a piece of that. What other candidates, what's going on in the spade work of politics to run for the presidency that we're not focused on because these bright lights are over covering this indictment?
I think that's such an important point, John. I was just in Iowa with former Vice President Mike Pence, and to me, he's a sleeper candidate in this race. I'm not saying he's going to be the nominee, but he could be the nominee. I still believe, based on reporting, talking to voters in Iowa and elsewhere, that there could be a late break for one contender or two contenders in this field as the Republican voters start to pay close attention. And Pence is out there talking to evangelical voters, religious voters, conservatives, and saying, I'm one of you, I'm from the Midwest, give me a chance, I'll enact the Trump agenda without the drama. That's essentially his pitch. And if you think about Pence, if he goes to farm after farm, town hall after town hall in Iowa, that's a lot like what Mike Huckabee did, what Ted Cruz did, what Rick Santorum did. So there is a playbook, even in the land of bright lights in American presidential politics, to do it the small ball way and maybe have a shot.
I'm going to ask you that question about 50 times, maybe more, between now and the voting. Robert Costa, thank you so much in Washington.
Thank you. Thank you.
And now there's even more legal trouble for the former president. A Manhattan judge on Tuesday granted E. Jean Carroll's request to revise her defamation suit against Donald Trump to include comments he made about her after he lost a separate civil suit that she had brought against him for sexual abuse. He was ordered to pay $5 million in that case. Carroll is now seeking another $10 million for defamation. Carroll, who was suing Trump separately for defamation, has now upped that amount. Tens of millions of Americans from Texas to Florida are under weather warnings and alerts. Several twisters like this one touched down Wednesday along the border between Alabama and Georgia, destroying homes and downing power lines. Mark Strassman is in southeast Alabama with the latest.
Hey, John. A half dozen reported tornadoes unnerved scores of people across the South for hours today, and this topple wall behind me will tell you why. Tonight, recovery from several tornadoes that tore across Alabama and Georgia today.
Look at the stuff flying.
A severe weather outbreak pummeling states from north to south. In Abbeville, Alabama, a reported large tornado cut through, damaging a few buildings, while nearby Eufaula fared worse, a twister downing trees and power lines.
It was like boom, 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 boom.
And damaging Brittany Shade's apartment building.
I was very scared. My heart was beating real fast. I ran in the room to get my little girl. Kept calling her name. She wouldn't wake up. I'm like, come on, it's a tornado out here.
The storms are part of a late-season system parked over the southeast, bringing waves of severe weather and record rainfall to the region. Yesterday, the system brought baseball-sized hail to Texas, and temperatures in the Lone Star State will top triple digits for much of the next week. More ugly weather is potentially on the way. A tornado watch in southeast Georgia and a severe thunderstorm watch in both Mississippi and Louisiana. John, a loud day of weather here in the southeast.
For more on the severe storms moving across the South, here's meteorologist Chris Warren from the Weather Channel.
An ongoing strong storm, severe weather threat going into the nighttime and even overnight hours for a huge portion of the South. Could be a few rounds of strong storms. Areas in red, the future radar indicating some of those strong storms. There they go and into tomorrow morning. Extremely large hail tonight, possible tornadoes, some strong, damaging winds with some of these long-lived thunderstorms. All a possibility. The threat continues into tomorrow evening. Not as big of a threat, but any one of these individual storms could potentially still do some damage. Here's a look at some of the heavy rain still to come over the next couple of days. A lot of this tonight and into tomorrow. Also watching the northeast, could see some storms with rain in the higher ends and parts of New England, about 1 to 2 inches. For more in-depth coverage, watch the Weather Channel on cable and now live on your favorite TV streaming device.
Chris Warren, thank you. The White House recently rejected a plan from its own Department of Homeland Security that would have allowed hundreds of thousands of migrants to live and work in the United States. We'll explore what was behind the decision and how it meshes with the thousands of others that are being allowed to stay. And the biggest Protestant denomination in the United States takes a stand to keep women from the altar. You're streaming CBS News Primetime. The Southern Baptist Convention have voted overwhelmingly to keep women from the pulpit. The decision from the nation's largest Protestant denomination expels a number of churches because they ordained female pastors. CBS News correspondent Janet Shamlian has more details.
The affirmative has it, and the motion carries.
The vote to ban female pastors in SBC churches praised like a Sunday sermon.
It puts us all on the same page about what a pastor is and who a pastor is, a biblically qualified man.
Members at the annual convention in New Orleans today overwhelmingly favored a constitutional amendment that requires a church, quote, employs only men as qualified pastors.
And Saddleback Church is not in friendly cooperation with the Southern Baptist Convention.
The SBC also refused to reinstate California megachurch Saddleback, expelled in February for ordaining women pastors. Founding pastor Rick Warren made a futile appeal to the almost 13,000 church representatives known as messengers.
I'm not asking you to agree with my church. I am asking you to act like a Southern Baptist.
5 churches with female pastors have been expelled from membership recently, including Fern Creek Baptist in Louisville, Kentucky. Pastor Linda Barnes Popham failed to get its expulsion overturned as well.
This is a sad day for Southern Baptists because they are losing gifted and talented and called women of God. As we continue to proclaim the gospel, why they want to get rid of folks like us makes no sense.
What does this say to the millions of women in the churches?
It says to those women, you are not valued.
The votes here in New Orleans are the latest effort to crack down on a perceived liberal shift in the organization. The SBC is the nation's largest Protestant group, but its population has dropped about 9% over the last 3 years. John?
Janet Shamlian in New Orleans. Thank you. The Biden administration is, for now, declining to offer nearly 400,000 Nicaraguan migrants a chance to live and work in the United States legally under the Temporary Protected Status Program. It's due in part to concerns that this may trigger a spike in border crossings. This comes after the administration announced Tuesday that it would extend the temporary legal status of more than 300,000 immigrants whose deportation protections were targeted by the Trump administration. The extension will allow existing TPS holders from El Salvador, Honduras, Nepal, and Nicaragua to continue living in the United States for 18 months. But the program will remain closed to new applicants. For more on this, I'm joined by CBS News immigration reporter Camilo Montoya Galvez. Camilo, help us understand what I just said, because on the one hand, it's not allowing some in and is allowing others in. What's the distinction?
Good evening, John. Temporary protected status for our audience is a policy dating back to 1990 that allows the Department of Homeland Security to grant work permits and deportation protections to immigrants and migrants from countries experiencing a crisis, such as an environmental disaster, John, or an armed conflict. And the Trump administration really did not like this program because they believed that prior administrations had abused this policy, and so it moved to terminate a lot of these programs, including for the 4 countries that you mentioned. This week, the Biden administration fully reversed that decision, John, and extended the TPS programs for these 4 countries, El Salvador, Honduras, Nepal, and Nicaragua. But importantly, John, the administration decided not to expand eligibility for these programs, and so they remain closed to new applicants. And sources tell CBS News, John, that the reason that the Biden administration decided against expanding TPS eligibility to hundreds of thousands of migrants already here in the U.S. is because of concerns that doing so would trigger a massive spike in migration along the border, despite the fact, John, that a TPS program does not benefit people who are not already here in the U.S. But that is the administration's concern. They have managed to keep the level of illegal border crossings relatively low compared to earlier this year and last year, and they do not want to jeopardize that, John.
So help me understand that. If the temporary protected program doesn't affect those who are not here, is this just heightened sensitivity for them about the inducements? Because, of course, one of the immigration arguments, as you know, has been this idea that laws encourage migration. And then, of course, the other argument is that they're pushed from the conditions in the countries from which they come. Is there a hypersensitivity here about the temporary protected status program, or is it something else?
That is the question at the center of this debate, John. Despite the fact that TPS only applies to migrants and immigrants who are already here on U.S. soil, over the past few years, officials in the government have expressed concern that any type of generous immigration policy announcement and program will nevertheless act as a pull factor that encourages migration to the U.S.-Mexico border. Because even though migrants don't technically qualify for these programs because they're outside of the U.S., smugglers might tell them otherwise, that they actually do qualify for these programs, or they might misunderstand U.S. policy. Right. And right now, the administration is launching a concerted effort, John, to try to keep these numbers at the border down, and they don't want to disrupt that by any means.
Right, because they feel like they're succeeding, and the numbers would seem to suggest that at some level. But what happens then, Camilo, after 18 months? What happens then?
Well, that is the longstanding problem with temporary protected status. I just emphasize the temporary. This program does not allow recipients to get a green card, to get permanent status here or U.S. citizenship. So administrations either have to extend that status, or these people have to find another way to get legal here, quote unquote. If the Biden administration is reelected, if President Biden is reelected, I assume the administration will move to extend those programs for another 18 months. But if a Trump administration or a DeSantis administration, if you will, take power in 2025, I assume that these programs will be terminated or at least limited significantly, and these people will be subject to deportation unless they find a way, again, to get permanent status here. Efforts in Congress to legalize this population, just like efforts to legalize the so-called Dreamer population, have been cut up in this broader gridlock in Congress, John, because right now Republicans do not want to legalize any subset of the immigrant population here unless there are significant restrictions on asylum along the U.S.-Mexico border. And that is the current stalemate. And I don't think we will see any changes to that situation anytime soon, John.
Indeed. Camilo Montoya Galvez, thank you so much.
Of course.
At least 78 migrants have drowned after a boat capsized and sank off the coast of southern Greece Wednesday. The International Organization for Migration has warned that the death toll may be much higher. It says there may have been up to 400 people on board. So far, more than 100 people have been rescued. Authorities say it appears the migrants had departed from Libya and were headed for Italy. There are new allegations against the armorer from the Rust movie set shooting. Prosecutors alleged Hannah Gutierrez-Reed was likely hungover when she loaded a live bullet into the revolver Alec Baldwin used when he shot and killed the film's cinematographer, Helena Hutchins. Lawyers for the weapons handler call the allegations character assassination. She is charged with involuntary manslaughter in Hutchins's death. Google users may soon be entitled to part of $23 million. The settlement with the tech giant allegedly comes from the tech giant's alleged sharing of searches with third-party websites without permission. Google denies any wrongdoing and says the settlement is not an admission of guilt. Anyone who used Google Search and clicked on a link between October 26, 2006 and September 30th, 2013 may receive some money. Experts estimate that payouts will be $7.70 per person. Users have until July 31st to submit a claim for the settlement. Ukrainian forces tried to gain momentum in their counteroffensive against Russian troops. What they say distinguishes them from the Russians and what they hope will push them to victory. You're streaming CBS News Primetime. Welcome back to CBS News Primetime. I'm John Dickerson. Here's a look at our top stories. The federal jury in the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting trial will begin deliberations as soon as Thursday morning. The alleged shooter has pleaded not guilty to 63 charges, including hate crimes charges. 11 people were killed and 6 wounded nearly 5 years ago. It was the worst anti-Semitic attack in U.S. history. Stunning footage shows the moment a cement pumping truck exploded in Texas on Wednesday. Officials say, wow, the fire started when the boom of the truck hit power lines. The worker inside was able to get out safely and no other injuries were reported. Sources tell CBS News former President Trump raised more than $2 million at his Bedminster fundraiser Tuesday night. Trump spoke there after his arraignment in Miami over his handling of classified documents. He has pleaded not guilty to 37 federal counts. As we've been reporting, the Federal Reserve will not be raising interest rates for the first time since March of 2022. Speaking to reporters Wednesday, Fed Chair Jerome Powell said holding rates steady allows the Fed to see how previous rate hikes continue to affect inflation. He cautioned, however, that the Federal Reserve may raise rates another 0.5 percentage points by the end of the year. Here to discuss today's decision and the tea leaves perhaps around it is J.D. Durkin. He's an on-air host for The Street, a digital financial news platform. So, J.D., what do you take out of what Powell said? And if this is a pause to see how things are going, it takes a little while for these rate changes to get through the digestive tract of the economy. But what are they looking for in this pause period?
I got to say, I talk with a lot of analysts every day, John. Not many use the phrase digestive tract to describe what's going on, but that's true. We've got leading indicators in the economy, things like manufacturing and housing. Then we've got these really stubborn lagging indicators, things like pricing and unemployment and the labor market. And I think after 10 consecutive short-term interest rate hikes, this is really Chairman Jay Powell and his colleagues saying, okay, maybe at least for right now, enough is enough. You can call it a hike. You can call it an intermission if you'd like. Don't call it a skip for whatever it's worth. I don't know if you caught this. He caught himself. He used the word skip and then said, okay, I actually shouldn't probably call it a skip. That's something a lot of economists and analysts will be digging into very closely. As you know, we follow every word the man says very closely.
And why skip, and how is skip different from hop and jump? I mean, why is there what does skip connote? And people will think this is absurd, but weighing the individual things he says, and this is kind of the lead to the next question. Mm-hmm. So the Fed makes a decision about rates, and then they send signals about what's happening in the future, and those signals are as powerful sometimes as what they do with actual rates. So is there something embedded in the idea of skip that we should be paying attention to?
Maybe not too much. I mean, admittedly, it gives us who work on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange a lot to talk about when we go on air tomorrow. Right. But admittedly, he caught himself, and he wanted to be very careful with what he says because he's got the really unenviable task here, John, as you know, of bringing inflation back down to 2%. People on Wall Street like to joke. They say, hey, I know the president's important, but it's really the chairman of the Federal Reserve who is incredibly important, especially at a moment like this. He knows every word he comes out and says, either in the written statements, the prepared remarks he makes, and then really in that question and answer portion are really important. And everyone's going to listen closely for some indication of what happens next. And we got that today.
I'm just going to let go of the skip business, although it's very hard for me. But it's funny you mentioned that people say that the president's not as important as the chairman of the Federal Reserve. The White House for a while was saying that, too, when they were getting blamed for the economy. Tell me about what the sense is on Wall Street, both about this decision today and just in general about things.
Well, I'll start with the second part first. I mean, in general, the conversation 3 to 4 months ago was the R word. It was recessions. You heard this in analyst note after analyst note. You heard this from CEO after CEO. And now you talk with analysts, John, and they're inclined to say recession. What recession? We're not really necessarily seeing that. There's a lot more optimism suddenly that the central bank may be able to, and I say this with cautious optimism, be able to stick this really difficult, soft landing. That has been the sort of goal of all this. Can we drive inflation back down to its ultimate goal of 2% without necessarily forcing the American economy into a recession? We still see spending strong across some parts of the economy, but this is an incredibly resilient American economy right now, and Chairman Powell said as much earlier today.
What are we to make of the chairman also said that supply chain issues weren't as bad as they thought, but that they still existed. What's your take from your reporting about supply chain and basically the ability of companies to get what they need to make what they need?
I think there's a reason we haven't talked as much about the supply chain challenge as we did this time last year or in 2021. One of the questions to Chairman Powell today was, well, how do you sort of give me your sense on the evolution of inflation? And he said, you're kind of dealing with two different chapters. Back in 2021, it was goods inflation. It's important to separate goods from services. So goods inflation meant a lot of people were at home. They had that extra COVID cash. They were spending money on goods they wanted around the house. And suddenly today, maybe some of that COVID cash has been worn down. They're still spending money, but it's now in the services part of the economy. And services are things like haircuts, as well as manicures. John, I do need a manicure. Don't look too closely and don't tell my mom. But there's stubborn parts of inflation in the services economy, I think helps explain today's inflation pattern. And that's really what the Fed is really closely focused on to get inflation back down to 2%.
You know, one of the underlying themes of the conversations we've had about the economy over the whole period where the Fed has been trying to catch up to inflation, because Powell's admitted that they were a little slow, is how hard it is to know what's going on in this post-pandemic economy. You talked about the resilience, but as you also mentioned, for so long, people were saying, oh, my gosh, the U.S. economy's got all these challenges. When you talk to analysts, how humble are they? I mean, analysts are always giving, you know, post hoc rationalizations for things that happen like they saw it coming. But is there a humility, or at least a kind of like, well, I don't know what's going to happen. This economy surprised us 1,000 times.
The number one phrase I always hear from economists or analysts is that you always hear this thing where they say, well, on the one hand, it could be this. On the other hand, it could be that. And that's everyone's favorite phrase when you talk about the economy, because it is so dense and it's difficult to project. I'm reminded of what President Harry Truman once famously remarked. I know you're a fan of history. You'll know this. He said, can anyone just bring me a one-handed economist? I would really like a straight down the middle answer, but it's very difficult. But to be fair, I don't oftentimes hear the words economic analyst and humility used in the same sentence for whatever it's worth. Everyone is trying to see, as you said at the top of our interview, where the puck is going from here, or how to read the tea leaves, so to speak.
J.D. Durkin, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Russian forces hit southern and eastern Ukraine with missiles early Wednesday morning, killing at least 6 people. The attacks come as Ukrainian forces continue to take back land seized by the Russians. CBS News foreign correspondent Ian Lee takes us to the front lines of Ukraine's counteroffensive.
Darkness is an ally for Ukrainian troops. Night vision gives this territorial defense brigade an advantage as they silently get into position. When day breaks, they attack. This soldier, call sign Blacksmith, stormed the Russian positions. Their defenses are strong, he tells me. The Russians had time to dig in. They defended fiercely, but lately they started running away. His squad just returned from the counteroffensive after taking ground from the Russians in what the deputy defense minister described today as extremely fierce battles along the front.
These troops are recalibrating their weapons after some heavy fighting on the front lines.
Captain Anton commanded the troops as they advanced under cover.
We have some groups which goes through the trees because the fields are not good.
There's a rule here when navigating landmines.
To be slow, to be silent, and to be safe.
Slow, silent, and safe.
Yeah, slow, silent, and safe.
That lesson helps them reach a Russian trench. But war has taught them, don't touch, he says. Anything could be booby-trapped. After moving hundreds of yards, the call comes in. Mop up and dig in.
Does it feel good to be finally on the offensive?
Yes, he tells me, morale was getting a bit low, but now we're attacking, we're ready to go.
These troops say they have a fighting spirit the Russians don't have, John, because they're defending their country, their families, and their homes.
Ian Lee in Dnipro, Ukraine. Thank you. Senior White House officials are trying to keep expectations low as Secretary of State Antony Blinken prepares for his upcoming trip to China. Blinken's trip had been planned for earlier this year, but it was abruptly canceled after the U.S. shot down a Chinese spy balloon that was flying in American airspace. White House officials say Blinken's visit will focus on establishing channels of communication with Chinese leaders in order to, quote, address misperceptions and prevent miscalculations. When the secretary arrives in Beijing Sunday, he will be the first American cabinet officer to visit since 2019. Henrietta Lacks is often referred to as the mother of modern medicine. Now her family is fighting to ensure she's honored for her contributions to the medical world. Natalie Brand explains.
We are so happy that finally the world is getting to know all about Henrietta Lacks.
More than 70 years after her death, Henrietta Lacks' mark on medical research lives on, a remarkable impact that her family and a group of lawmakers want to honor with the Congressional Gold Medal. 88-year-old Lawrence Lacks is Henrietta's only living child.
She gave so much of most of her life to making everybody else happy and well-being and get better health.
Lacks was a cancer patient at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore in the 1950s when doctors removed tissue samples for research without her consent. Her cells became the first human cell line to reproduce indefinitely, becoming a critical research tool for the development of vaccines and medical treatments to this day. Her grandson, Ron, wrote a book about her life.
Her impact was medical miracles. To be here today and how everybody's listening to the Lacks family story is amazing in itself.
Lacks' family and lawmakers are now pushing to honor her legacy and raise awareness about the recognition she was denied in her lifetime.
I'm hurt today, filled with joy but hurt. And to this family, I want to simply publicly apologize, for this should have never happened.
Decades later, they say it's time to fully recognize Henrietta Lacks' life-saving contributions to science. Natalie Brand, CBS News, Washington.
A new oceanic discovery, but not on this planet. Scientists discovered a moon in our solar system that has the ingredients needed to support life. We'll tell you where it is and what it means for the future of space exploration. You're streaming CBS News Primetime. Scientists say there's a place in our solar system outside of Earth that has the chemical makeup to potentially support life. That place is Enceladus, Saturn's sixth largest moon. Researchers pored over data collected by a joint NASA-European spacecraft mission and found the moon's ocean contains phosphorus, which is found in human teeth and bones as well as DNA. This is the first time the element has been discovered in an ocean that's not on our planet. CBS News space consultant Bill Harwood joins me now from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. So, Bill, this is fantastic, I think. So they found phosphorus on this moon. Scientists say that means it could support life. So what's next? What do we do with this discovery?
Well, you know, one of the critical things to keep in mind, John, is first of all, they already knew that organic compounds and other molecules that are necessary for life as we know it existed in this subsurface ocean on Enceladus. But the phosphorus is the least abundant of these kinds of ingredients. And finding that really adds strength to the case that Enceladus has a possibly habitable environment under its frozen crust. You know, they think there's an ocean under the surface of Enceladus that may possibly be an abode for life. Of course, just because the ingredients are there doesn't mean life is there. They need to study this a lot more. They need to send additional spacecraft down the road, and they certainly want to do that. But for right now, it sure makes a strong case.
Now, before we get to the nuts and bolts about how they figure this stuff out, when we're talking about life here, I mean, what are we realistically talking about? I mean, are we talking about enormous things, or are we maybe talking about some microbes?
We're probably talking about microbial life. You know, and a key point there, though, is, you know, we say life as we know it. You know, what does that mean? Well, we only have one sample of life, and that's life on Earth. So we look for the chemical processes that allow, you know, DNA and self-replicating cells as they developed on Earth. You're looking for similar processes somewhere else that could perhaps lead to that sort of life on that world. Does that mean there couldn't be some other way to come up with life? And I suppose there could be, but we can only look for the stuff that we know something about, and that's life as we know it on Earth.
And as we're looking for the stuff we know about, how do we go about looking for it? You mentioned that there's an ocean under the frozen ice. So how do we go about, you know, dipping the old pH strip? I mean, how does this happen?
Yeah, it's interesting. The neat thing about Enceladus is they have these geysers on the south polar regions of the moon that are spewing out water vapor, icy, salty ice particles from that subsurface ocean that are venting out through cracks in the crust. And they've analyzed those. The Cassini spacecraft you referenced at the top flew through those plumes. A cosmic dust collector on that spacecraft actually collected some of these grains that they could study, and that's how they detected the presence of phosphorus. So they know there's water under the surface. The question is, how do you find out more about that, barring drilling down into that ice and seeing what's there? I mean, ideally, that's what you'd like to do, but doing that at the distance of Saturn with a robotic spacecraft is a tall order, and I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.
And I understand that NASA has plans.
Unfortunately.
Right, exactly. I want this tomorrow. And NASA has plans, though, to explore another moon in our solar system that may also have this mix or a similar mix. Tell us about that mission.
Yeah, that's called the Europa Clipper. That's a multi-billion-dollar mission NASA plans to launch in the next couple of years. It's not only going to explore Europa, which is a moon that they think is a prime candidate for a subsurface ocean with possibly habitable environment. It's also going to make repeated flybys of 3 other moons in the system, including Ganymede and Callisto, which are very large moons that have those same sorts of frozen crust. And on top of the NASA mission, the Europeans just launched a spacecraft called JUICE. It stands for the Jupiter Icy Moons mission that's going to go to Jupiter also and look for more signs of habitable environments, all in this thirst, I'll call it, to find out if it's possible that life could exist somewhere else in this solar system. That's a big deal in astrobiology, and these spacecraft are going to certainly go see what they can find out in that regard.
Well, it's a big deal in my house where we know nothing about astrobiology. It's an amazing search. Bill, it's always a great pleasure to talk to you.
It really is.
Bill Harwood at the Kennedy Space Center. It will be a wedding night to remember for a couple in the UK, and the local police had a hand in making things go off without a hitch. We'll explain. You're streaming CBS News Primetime. Get me to the church on time. 2 brides in the UK had to be escorted to their wedding by the police. The 2 were heading to the ceremony. Everything was just fine when the bus carrying their wedding party broke down on the side of the road. But instead of having to linger in the lorry, thankfully, the bride's friends were quick-witted and they were able to flag down 2 police officers who agreed to take the brides to the altar.
We'd seen that a police car was passing by, and one of the bridal parties, one of my good friends, Danielle, actually went up to speak to them to ask, could they give us a lift? And that's when they said yes, and we couldn't quite believe it. And we got into the back of the police car, and yeah, away we went.
Gold star for Danielle. All of the other guests ended up taking Ubers or taxis to the ceremony to watch the couple say, I do. Up next, it's 48 hours for all of us here at CBS News Primetime. That's our report. I'm John Dickerson. Thank you for spending the hour with us.